Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I am Dr. Aamnah Sajid, and today we are going to discuss the classification of proteins. Proteins can be classified on the basis of structure and on the basis of physical properties. First of all, we are going to discuss the classification based on structure. So, structurally, proteins can be divided into two categories. First is fibrous proteins, and the second one is globular proteins. And as the name indicates, fibrous proteins are present in the form of long fibers, that is, they have an elongated shape, and they can be scientifically described as proteins with axial ratio greater than 10. So what is meant by axial ratio? Axial ratio is basically the ratio of length of the protein to its width. So if this ratio is greater than 10, or in other words, if the length of the protein is 10 times that of its width, then the protein will be classified as fibrous protein. And these fibrous proteins, they are insoluble in water. And examples of fibrous proteins include collagen, elastin, keratin, etc. Now moving on to globular proteins. So what is globular proteins? Globular proteins are those proteins which are spherical or ovoid in shape, and they can be defined as proteins with axial ratio less than 10. This means that the ratio of the length of globular proteins to their width is going to be less than 10. And globular proteins, unlike fibrous proteins, are water soluble. Fibrous proteins we discussed before are water insoluble, and globular proteins are water soluble. Some examples include hemoglobin, albumins, globulins, etc. So now we are going to discuss the classification of proteins based on their physical properties, and based on those they can be classified into simple proteins and conjugated proteins. Now simple proteins are going to have many other groups in them as well, and conjugated proteins also have different categories, and they are based on their physical properties that we will discuss in a while. So first of all, we will discuss simple proteins. Now simple proteins are further divided into different categories, first of which are proteins. Now proteins are soluble in water, dilute acids and alkalis, and they are non-coagulable by heat. And one of the very important properties of proteins is that they are basic proteins, that is, they have a basic nature, and these are basically nucleoproteins, which means that they are present inside the nuclei in combination with nucleic acids. So these proteins, they form compounds with nucleic acids, therefore they are known as nucleoproteins. And two examples of these nucleoproteins or proteins are salmine and sardinine, which are present in fish. So the second category of proteins categorized as simple proteins are histones. Now histones are also basic proteins, and they are also nucleoproteins, and histones can also be found in humans. They are very important nucleoproteins which are present in combination with DNA inside the nuclei of human cells. And these histones are soluble in water, dilute acids and alkalis, and they are not readily coagulable on heating, that is, they have to be heated for quite some time before they coagulate. And once again, they are also basic in nature, and the examples are nucleohistones, which are present in humans. So another category of simple proteins is albumins. Albumins are small globular proteins which are soluble in water and dilute salt solutions, and they coagulate on heating. Some examples include plant albumins such as legumulin in legumes and leucosin in cereals. And animal albumins include ove albumin in egg, lactalbumins in milk, and serum albumin. And serum albumin, as you might be knowing by now, are the main source of oncotic pressure inside the plasma. Now What are globulins? They are also simple proteins which are insoluble in water but soluble in dilute salt solutions, and they also coagulate on heating. And some examples include hemoglobin, ceruloplasmin, transferrin, immunoglobulins, etc. Another type of simple proteins are gliadins, which are also known as prolamines, and these are basically plant proteins which are insoluble in water or salt solutions and also in 100% alcohol, but they are soluble in 50 to 80% of ethanol solution. And example include gliadin, which is found in wheat. So another type of simple plant proteins is glutellins, which are insoluble in water or salt solutions but soluble in dilute acids and alkalis, and they also coagulate on heating. An example includes glutellin, which is also found in wheat plant. Now, another type of simple proteins are Saccharo proteins, which are also known as albuminoids. And these proteins are highly stable in nature, which form supporting structures in animals, and they have very low solubility in different types of solution. And examples include keratin, collagen, and elastin. And these proteins, on the basis of structure, can also be classified as fibrous proteins, and on the basis of physical properties they are known as Saccharo proteins or albuminoids, and these are very stable proteins. That is why they are an important part of connective tissues at different sides of the body. So we are all done with simple proteins. Now we move on to conjugated proteins. Now conjugated proteins, as the name indicates, are basically simple proteins which are present in combination with a non-protein group or with another type of molecule. And first of all we are going to discuss nucleoproteins. Now nucleoproteins are comprised of a simple protein plus nucleic acid, and as we discussed earlier, histones are an example of basic proteins and simple proteins which are going to combine with nucleic acid such as DNA to form nucleoproteins. So examples include nucleohistones and nucleoprotamines. So now the second category of conjugated proteins that we are going to discuss are mucoproteins or mucoids, which are also known as proteoglycans, and these are simple proteins which combine with mucopolysaccharides or glycosaminoglycans such as hyaluronic acid and chondroitin sulfate. So these are simple proteins which form bonds with glycosaminoglycans, which are a type of heteropolysaccharides, and in combination they form another type of conjugated proteins known as mucoproteins or mucoids or proteoglycans. And examples include the proteins which are found in mucins and connective tissues around the body. Now glycoproteins are simple proteins which are present in combination with some carbohydrate component or carbohydrate moiety, and examples include immunoglobulins, a number of enzymes, hormones such as FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone. So inside the body a number of different glycoproteins are present. Many enzymes are glycoprotein in nature, hormones are glycoprotein in nature, and these are proteins which are present in combination with some carbohydrate component. Now chromoproteins are simple proteins which are present in combination with a colored substance such as heme proteins like hemoglobin, cytochromes, catalase enzyme, peroxidase enzyme. In all these examples there is going to be a protein component which has combined with a colored substance, and because of that colored substance these proteins possess some color. That is why they are known as chromoproteins, and they are another type of conjugated proteins. So phosphoproteins are simple proteins which combine with organic phosphate, and these are also an example of or a category of conjugated proteins. And the most commonly known example of phosphoproteins is casein, which is found in milk. Another phosphoprotein is ovovitalin, which is present inside egg yolk. So lipoproteins are conjugated proteins which comprise of simple proteins plus lipids, and examples include chylomicrons, VLDL, which is very low density lipoprotein, LDL, which is low density lipoprotein, and HDL, which is high density lipoprotein. And you might have heard of LDL and HDL before in terms of cholesterol, and you should uh, remember that LDL and HDL are basically lipoproteins with a protein component as well as a lipid component. Now, metalloproteins, as the name indicates, are comprised of simple proteins in combination with a metal ion, and examples include ferritin, which contains iron, carbonic anhydrase enzyme, which contains zinc, ceruloplasmin, which contains copper. So this was all about conjugated proteins. So far we have discussed the classification of proteins based on their structure and based on their physical properties. Now there is a third way of classifying proteins, which is classification of proteins based on their functions. And the first category in this classification is that of catalytic proteins, which are also known as enzymes, because there are a number of proteins which catalyze different metabolic processes in our body, and therefore they are known as enzymes. And these enzymes, they may be simple proteins or they may be conjugated proteins, and you can give any example. I have chosen two enzymes, alkaline phosphatase and alkaline transaminase, but you can give any example of catalytic proteins. Now the second category in this classification is that of hormones or regulatory proteins. So there are many proteins and peptides which are acting as hormones, and that is why they are classified as regulatory proteins. And why hormones are termed as regulatory proteins? Because hormones control, or in other words, they are in charge of many different metabolic processes that are taking place inside our body. So those proteins which act as hormones, they are categorized as regulatory proteins, and you can give any example. I have chosen insulin and growth hormone. In addition, there are also other types of hormones which are proteins in nature, or they are peptides. You can give their example as well. Now, the third category in this type of classification is that of structural proteins, and these are those proteins which are important parts of important components of connective tissues in various sites of the body. And the two most commonly known examples are collagen and elastin. Now, transport proteins. These proteins transport or carry different substances in blood. For example, hemoglobin, which carries oxygen in blood, transferrin, which transports iron, ceruloplasmin, which transports or carries copper. So what are immune proteins? Immune proteins are basically immunoglobulins, which are also known as antibodies, and they form a very important part of our body's immune mechanisms. And examples include IgA, IgG, IgM, IgD, and IgE. Now, another category of proteins in this type of classification is contractile proteins, and these are those proteins which are involved in the contraction of different types of muscles, and examples include actin and myosin. So what are storage proteins? These are those proteins which can be broken down inside the body to release energy and to meet nutritional requirements. For example, casein protein, which is found in milk, and gliadin protein, which is present in wheat. Both these types of proteins, they can be broken down if needed to release energy which is utilized by body cells. So the last category of proteins present in this type of classification is nuclear proteins, also known as nucleoproteins. Now these are proteins which are present in combination with nucleic acids such as histones and protamines, and these perform very important functions. One that you should remember is that histone proteins, they are involved in the wrapping of DNA inside the nucleus. So these nucleoproteins, they perform many different functions, but this is the most important that you should be knowing. So this was all about the classification of proteins. If you have any queries, you can mail me. Best of luck from my side, and thank you.